are you asking for help? Um, it looks like majority, right? Close to 40% of people say it's somewhat difficult. Very small percentage of people said it's very easy, but a quarter of the people said it's somewhat easy. How do you feel when you take the time to practice self-care? So when you do practice it, you're very happy, right? But you've got a lot of people that say, oh, I feel guilty. I feel kind of guilty doing this. And I know she's going to touch upon that. And then I understand how to incorporate self-care in my day. And we've got some percentage of people who say I'm not sure how. So that's okay. We're here to learn about that and talk about that. So I'm going to stop, and without further ado, I'm going to stop talking because you're not here to listen to me completely. And I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Kameelah. Take it away.
Okay, alhamdulillah. I'm really excited to be here with everyone. I know that many of you are possibly coming from different places, and so what I want to encourage us all to do first is just to make our intention to be in this space, right? Like there are probably obligations and thoughts and worries that are pulling us and always in different directions. But what I want to encourage you to do is to take a deep breath and do that 3 times, and really say to yourself, my intention is going to be here in this conversation with this community of women for the next 90 minutes. It seems like a very simple thing to do, but it's not. And so when we explicitly kind of make that known, it then helps hold ourselves accountable. And so I'm going to just pause for everyone to take 3 deep breaths, and to to kind of invite yourself to be in this conversation, to open your heart and your mind, and to be in the dialogue, in this discussion, in this conversation, in this community with self-compassion, right? With kindness, and to as much as possible put on hold any self-critical thoughts that may pop up, right? Even any thoughts that may have popped up from the poll, right? So I'm going to pause here. Please take 3 deep breaths in through your nose and exhale. And let's do that again. Okay, and last time. Okay, and that really serves to, one, help us regulate our sort of nervous system to get the oxygen flowing, and also to, with intention, to be here. If you're have any responsibilities like mine, it is trying to make sure that maybe children are kind of settled in somewhere, or maybe you have dinner going at some point, but you deserve this time. Right? You've earned it. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. This sort of conversation is going to be broken up into about 3 parts. So I wanted to provide all of us with kind of a working definition of self-care, of trauma, of sort of the factors that lead to burnout, followed by a self-reflection activity, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. What I will say is that we could probably have part 2, part 3, part 4 of this conversation. So if you find yourself being a little frustrated, or you're wondering, oh man, I wish we could kind of go on, perhaps that is something that we can discuss. Maybe we will have a part 2. But again, it's being open to where we are here, and where we end, only Allah knows. But that we can really decide how we want to continue this conversation, either online or perhaps schedule another session, which I'm open to, Sabrina, and to Sada. So I'll just put that out there now. So I'm going to share my screen so that you all can see what I'm going to be kind of reviewing. Feel free to take a screenshot if you want. I will be sending the slides to the organizers. So again, if you have maybe a pencil and paper or a pen, I know that's kind of old school now, but if you can just write down your questions as I go along, or put them in the chat, that'd also be great, just so that you can remember maybe what resonated or what piqued your interest. but kind of uh, resist the urge to sort of like take copious notes, because that will engage you intellectually, but it won't really engage you emotionally. Okay, so rest assured that you'll have the slides. We'll send out links to resources and to sources. And so this is just a reminder to try to be as present as possible, inshallah. Okay, so here we go. Okay. Okay. So I'm hoping everybody is all in the right Zoom. If you're not, you can feel free to exit if this is not what you were expecting. But healing trauma through self and community care, and I have to say, just from the outset, that my sort of view and perspective on self-care is that it's a practice. It's not an event, right? It's not, well, I need a spa day, or I have to get my hair done or my nails done, but it's really a practice in how we prioritize ourselves, how we think about our health, how we think about, what makes us effective in whatever role that we're in, starting with ourselves, right? How can I be kinder and gentler, more empathetic towards myself, so that I can extend all of that grace and that patience to other people? So it's a practice, and that it takes practice, right? It's not something that's easy to do. And for reasons that we'll discuss, it's really, really difficult. I just want to put that out there, that we're not socialized to do this, and particularly women of color. And so when we're talking about what self-care means, I encourage folks to think about it as how we maintain a network of relationships that help us connect, that help us stay grounded, that help us feel affirmed and validated in who we are. And so that involves a community always. We cannot do self-care individually. Okay. So with that, I also wanted to provide kind of an overview of what we will discuss, because sometimes that helps also with knowing, what we're going to cover, and, kind of where the road is leading. So I am going to provide, again, some definitions, an overview of trauma, and then think about, very briefly, strategies for coping. Like I mentioned to Sabrina and set off yesterday, I think when we start to sort of conceptualize or think about self-care, we sort of want really quick, like easy tips. Like, give me a really good tip for how I can sort of feel less burned out or less stressed. But the truth of the matter is that we can have, and we probably already have, right, a laundry list of tips. What I want to focus on today is, what are the reasons why I find it so difficult to pick one of those tips and actually follow through on it, right? What makes building a practice of self-care so difficult, right? Even though we know we need it, even though we're always encouraged, right? Sort of capitalism has also gotten into, this area of self-care. So, people want to sell you things, right? They want you to buy things in order to feel better. But even with that, right, we're always typically coming up feeling still very overextended, very exhausted, really unable to sustain, right, those habits that we know are really important for us. So we're going to delve into why. So this is one of my favorite quotes from Audre Lorde, and she was a Black queer woman poet. And when she talked about her multiple identities, what she said was, in thinking about her silence, the anger, the things that she did not say, this quote, I think, really captures part of the reason why self-care can be so difficult, right? What are the words you do not yet have, right? What do you need to say? What are the tyrannies you swallow day by day and attempt to make your own, until you will sicken and die of them, still in silence? And so much of the barrier to self-care is feeling unworthy of it, right? It is the silence around all of that we're managing, but we're suffering. We're doing it very silently because we believe that we should. We're often doing it feeling very lonely and disconnected. And so those are the tyrannies, right? In addition to what is systemic, right? And we'll talk about that. Um, but we have, many of us, if not all of us, have internalized this idea that we must always exhibit strength. We must always be sort of patiently persevering. And so we cannot ask for help, right? Because then help would be a sign or a signal to others that we're not good enough, that we're weak, that we just can't handle life. Um, and so we swallow all of these things day by day, right? All of the messages that perhaps we are not worthy, we are not good enough, we are just not faithful enough, right? And those are the internalized messages that cause us to become really, really sick. So, what is self care? I also had a poll that I wanted to do through Poll Everywhere, but I think maybe we'll come back to it towards the end, because the poll at the very beginning kind of gave us a clue, right, as to where folks are coming in, what we're thinking about, what we need in order to ask for help. So I kind of want to dive right in, and then we can return to this, inshallah. So I have this here because this is typically what we think of when we think of self-care. That it's going to the spa, it's getting a massage, right? It's maybe getting our eyebrows done. I don't know about you all, but since COVID, I've become very reacquainted with long lost friends, and those were my eyebrows from 1996. So, we think, if I buy this, if I go here, if I, invest in this thing, right, that will be my self-care, right? When it's really a practice that has to begin from the inside out. So we're going to talk about what is the sort of the context of trauma that makes this very, very difficult for us. And when I say us, I'm talking specifically about Muslim women, women of color, and then I will spend some time talking about the specific kind of unique context for Black Muslim women. So when we're thinking about trauma, it's a very general definition. And unfortunately, a lot of times people will use the word trauma sort of colloquially, right? Meaning not the clinical definition that I may use as a psychologist, but really trauma can fall under the category of an event or situation that leaves you feeling overwhelmed, right? Or alone. And it's not simply what happens to you directly, it's also what you witness. So if you witness something happening to someone else that is painful, that is overwhelming, that happens unexpectedly, that happens repeatedly, that you feel powerless, right? And you feel like you can't prevent it from happening, that can be a traumatic situation. And so when we're thinking about the general definition, it is understandably very specific to the individual. Something that may make me feel really overwhelmed may not be overwhelming for someone else. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. What is also important to keep in mind is, even when we witness vicariously harmful events happening to other people, it can have a really, really strong impact on us. And so when we think about, for instance, the most recent murders, right? And I'm going to call the name of Breonna Taylor. To think about a young woman who's an EMT, helping save people's lives during a pandemic, who's shot to death in her bed, right? That is traumatic for many of us, because it happens unexpectedly. It happens repeatedly. It happens in ways that we feel powerless to prevent, right? And so we're a witness to the loss of life, and that there is no justice, right? That is a traumatic event. When we're talking about historical trauma, we're calling to mind sort of the wounding over generations, right? Through major events like colonization, genocide, enslavement, the transatlantic slave trade, for those who identify as descendants of enslaved Africans. And so those are trauma events that research has shown stays with us, right? It doesn't go away. And that specific racial trauma is just the cumulative effect, right, of witnessing murders, of understanding that the historical trauma still lives within us, right, even down to the the cellular level, right? In our DNA, there's a lot of markers that are passed down. And so that contributes to stress, right? It's all around us. Many of you may be familiar with the term microaggressions. And I think sometimes the name sounds like counterintuitive or is misnomer, because they're not micro in the sense that they're small or they're insignificant, but they happen so subtly. And what is really damaging about microaggressions is that it's what's called attributional ambiguity, right? So if you've ever found yourself in a circumstance where you're thinking, wow, that person was really rude. I'm not sure if it's because I'm brown or I'm black or because I'm a woman or because I'm Muslim or because of any other identity. I'm not sure if that's the reason, or perhaps it's all of the above. That process of trying to figure out, right, what is the reason for this disrespect? What is the reason for this discrimination becomes a cognitive process that can then really exhaust your mental energy, right? So imagine that happening multiple times per day, right? The offender or the perpetrator of that microaggression maybe doesn't even think twice, right? They make some kind of offhand remark or they say something to someone else and they forget about it, right? But you may be fuming in your car, right? You may be thinking like, oh man, I wish I could cuss them out. I wish I could say something, right? Or am I being too sensitive, right? Am I making a big deal out of nothing? So imagine perhaps you spend 5 minutes of your day recalling to mind one incident. I'm just going to say 5 minutes. It's usually a lot longer, but that happens, say 5, 6 times per day, right? Depending on where you are. That is potentially a half hour to an hour of your life, right? Where your mental energy is being drained by an event that maybe you felt powerless to prevent, right? That it is exhausting because it happens repeatedly. Okay. So if we're living always within the context of white supremacy, of oppression, of racism, we're going to be encountering these kind of incidents, whether they register, right, as significant or not. They're still impacting our bodies. So this is just kind of just a visual of all of the different ways that we can be impacted by trauma. And what I'm going to pull out is sort of this loss of sense of self, loss of trust in other people, this hypervigilance, right? Always kind of being on guard for what if something happens? Am I prepared? What could I do? Will someone come to my assistance, right? If there is an incident. And so again, that mental energy that it takes to constantly be on high alert, right, could be the very reason why you feel exhausted at the end of the day, right? It's not so much like, oh, I've done a lot of work and, I'm just tired, right? There's also a mental fatigue. There's a mental exhaustion that comes from being aware of all of the ways in which you could be marginalized because of who you are. Dr. Kenneth Hardy is a professor at Drexel University, and I really love sort of how he's framed what he calls the hidden wounds of racial trauma, right? And so what he's indicating here is that, again, with the microaggressions, with the small and really large overt acts of discrimination, either that happens to you or what you witness, you take that in. So what I want to sort of establish as norm, right, is that we all internalize these messages of inferiority. We internalize messages that we are not good enough because we are not white, right? This is simply the way that oppression and white supremacy works, right? That white supremacy elevates those who identify as white and subjugates or dominates those who are not, right? And that's embedded in every single aspect of our lives, right? Down to something as small as after 100 years, Band-Aid has decided that, maybe we should make bandages that are actually the color of the skin of other people, not just white people, right? I was fortunate enough to be able to find a Black Muslim-owned family who makes a product called Browndages, right? So these bandages are in different colors. But think about it, after 100 years, right, there's, sort of this I call it the George Floyd effect, right? So post that, there's, a lot of conversation about Black Lives Matter and systemic injustice. And this is what this company decides to do, right? Now we're going to be committed to making bandages in different colors, right? Very small thing, but what it indicates is that you are invisible. You are not a priority, right? That people, you're an afterthought. And so when we're sort of always immersed in that context, it's very difficult. We have to be very intentional about resisting the internalization of those messages, which contributes to this assaulted sense of self, right? Which contributes to a sense of rage. And what Dr. Hardy says is that rage is a natural and inevitable, right, response to injustice, right? However, what we're taught to believe is that we should be very gracious, we should be very forgiving, we should be very patient, we shouldn't get mad, right? And that's what oppression, that's what white supremacy tells you, right? That you should suffer politely, that you should be grateful for what you do have, when in fact, rage and anger are signs that something is wrong, right? And so we should feel something, we should feel pain, we should feel anger, we should feel a sense of this isn't right, and we must do something, right, in order to change what is the status quo. What he also talks about is this internalized voicelessness, right? That when we experience on multiple levels, both individual, familial, community, on a societal level, that level of injustice and oppression, we begin to lose our voices, our ability to speak. We're overwhelmed, right? And so when we're thinking about the wounds of racial trauma, what he says is it's really affirmation and acknowledgement being the first step and being able to work through it, right? We have to make legible, we have to make visible those things that we are taught to believe are just in our minds, right? Like, oh, that didn't really happen, right? Maybe you're making a big deal out of it. Well, maybe they weren't really trying to be mean or rude. Maybe you're just taking it that way, right? How many of us have heard that, right? So when we're taking all of that in over the course of days and weeks and months and years, we start to feel overwhelmed and then we're silent. Okay, so when Audre Lorde talks about the silences, the tyrannies that we swallow, right, until we sicken and die of them, these wounds of racial trauma is part of the tyranny. So when we're talking about also intergenerational trauma, the question that I always ask, right, and it's sometimes really difficult to answer, is not just what happened to you in your life, right? But I want to know what happened to your mama, what happened to your people, right? What happened to those who are part of the community that you identify with, right? Because again, trauma is about what you witness, right? What has happened before? Do you know the stories, right? Often our mothers or mother figures are reluctant to share, perhaps because they're still voiceless, right? But they're very reluctant to share their own stories of pain. And so we may have an inkling, right? We may say, there's something that she won't talk about, right? Or I've asked that question and she just sort of just goes quiet, right? Or she gives me a look and I know, end of discussion, we're not going to talk about that, right? So intergenerational trauma is looking at what are the patterns, what are the themes of hurtful, painful incidents that have happened in your family life, in your community life. Rizma Menakem is a Black social worker who does a lot of work on the body and how trauma impacts us. And he sort of developed this way of framing trauma's impact on our bodies by calling it trauma ghosting, right? So this sense that danger is just around the corner, something terrible is going to happen, right? How many of us feel the sense of impending doom? And we think, well, subhanAllah, maybe I should just be more optimistic, right? Why am I so cynical? Why am I always sort of looking for the other shoe to drop, right? But if you're in touch with, right, the intergenerational trauma, the historical trauma, what you may be acutely aware of is that sense of danger is not, it's not because you're just cynical, right? It's you acknowledging that there has been systemic, right, experiences of the people in your life or the people in your community that actually validate that sense of impending danger. Racial battle fatigue is a term that was developed by William Smith, and he developed this sort of framework really from his research on Black male college students at predominantly white campuses. And what he said was this ongoing kind of cumulative stress, right, from being in hostile, unsupportive, unwelcoming environments has not just an emotional effect, right? It has a physiological effect, a psychological effect, so that you have difficulty sleeping, right? You're always hypervigilant. You're sort of on guard for how do I protect myself, right? When something unexpected could happen to me that could be potentially lethal, right? And this fatigue, right, sort of settles in, and what he likens it to is post-traumatic stress, right? That the level of anxiety is so high. Um, and often there are not very many spaces that will acknowledge, right, that that fatigue is there, sort of like settling into your bones. So I want to kind of pause here and speak specifically to the unique, I think, set of circumstances that Black women, that Black Muslim women may face. And this image is from uh, 2017, from one of the women's marches in DC, I believe. And at first glance, right, it's like, oh, here's this white guy. He's so woke. He's like, yes, listen to Black women, all that, right? Here's the problem. It puts the burden always on Black women to perform a kind of labor that is uncompensated, that's unrecognized, that is not respected, right? And so this idea of like, screw it, I'll do it, is meant to kind of pay homage to, how strong Black women are and they get the job done and they're always there and, we should rely on them. But what it doesn't state, or what it doesn't sort of acknowledge as problematic, is that we should not be put into those positions to begin with, right? That we're also deserving of protection. We're also deserving of respect that sort of isn't conditional, right? As long as you perform this labor for us, right? As long as you save us from ourselves, right? Then we'll listen, right? Because what happens when Black women are vocal and outspoken in ways that challenge folks to look inward, that challenge folks to really think about their own anti-Blackness, right? Their own sexism, right? Then it's like, well, I know we said listen to Black women, but y'all are just too loud, right? You talk too much, right? You make me uncomfortable. You're so angry. Can you just say that with a softer voice, right? Your tone is just making me really uncomfortable. These are some of the things that we've heard, right? So when it comes to the burden that's placed on Black women, it also leads to burnout, right? It leads to higher levels of stress. The thinking about even the mortality, the infant mortality, right? Or what it means to be a Black mother. The statistics are glaring in terms of the disparities, right? So when you have someone like Serena Williams, who's a world-class, like unmatched athlete, having to advocate for herself and say, you know what, I just gave birth and I need you to listen to me and listen to my body because I'm not feeling well. She talks about this, right? Her sort of birth story. Nobody's listening, right? Or only listening for what makes them feel comfortable. And so it contributes to this term, this quote, sojourner syndrome. So if you know anything about Sojourner Truth, she was formerly enslaved. She was an abolitionist. She was a suffragist. And at one point she was giving a speech. She wasn't literate, right? But she was very, very intelligent. And she was sort of pointing out, right, the differences between how Black men were treated and how white women were treated, right? And she says, well, I'm a woman too, right? I deserve to be cared for, right? But no one is sort of laying down their coats over a puddle for me, right? I'm not seen as fragile or vulnerable, right? Or worthy of respect. Um, and when we internalize those messages of always having to be strong, always having to sort of pitch in and be the voice of sort of moral conscience for others, that's work, right? That leads to burnout. That's stressful. Um, and so what I wanted to sort of share really briefly here is, an incident that happened in the course of my own training, right? I was and am continue to be very vocal about racism, about, the psychological impact of white supremacy. And I was at a clinical site and I was explaining to an older white male supervisor about this labor, right? What it means to push back against his own unexamined sort of implicit bias, and how hurtful it is, right? To be very acutely aware of the power differential, right? To be aware that when I'm vocal, I can also be punished, um, and that it takes a lot of um, just moral kind of energy and confidence that isn't always there. But you feel forced into these positions of having to really strongly advocate for yourself or suffer the consequences. And so I'm explaining this, and I said, I'm hurting right now having to explain all of this to you, knowing that some of it you're not believing, that you don't, have a level of humility to accept what I'm sharing with you, as part of the harm that you've committed. And he said to me, it didn't look like you were in distress, right? So now imagine, right, constantly being in circumstances in which you're expected to be strong, you're expected to be stoic, right? But on the inside, you're hurting, right? And I believe that many of us have heard this, some version of this, which says, well, it didn't look like you were sad, right? Or I didn't think it really hurt you that much because it didn't show, right? Um, this is part of the burnout, right? So again, a massage, a mani pedi, it's not going to make these kinds of stressors go away, right? We can manage them as best we can, but we're talking about what is the systemic context that really makes self-care difficult to access, right? Because there are layers. So weathering is another term that sort of describes the unique impact on Black women, right? One of the sort of not just sort of like folklore, but what people say is like, oh, Black women, Black don't crack, they look so much younger than their age. The truth of the matter is, right, research has shown that if you're thinking about sort of not just the chronological age, but the physical aging process that happens because you're constantly dealing with sexism, with patriarchy, with racism, with anti-Blackness within the Muslim community, with misogyny, which is like a combination of both racism and sexism from within the Black community, it has an aging effect, right? It really erodes your physical health, right? And this is called weathering. So the last thing I want to add here, right? So we talked about, there's the personal trauma you may experience, historical trauma, intergenerational, right? The racial trauma, the battle fatigue, the weathering, right? And for Black women, it is this idea that we must be, strong and always present for other people, never asking for anything in return. I mean, other women experience this as well, but when we're thinking about sort of the historical legacy of slavery, it is that Black women are expected to perform uncompensated labor for everyone, right? So there's that. Now, add on top of it, like that's not enough, right? Add on top of it COVID-19, right? A pandemic, a global pandemic, right? We haven't seen on this scale probably in 100 years, okay? So not only are we dealing with sort of the microaggressions, the sort of current, past, historical trauma, it is the emotional impact of the level of uncertainty and of um, distress, right, that we all feel to some degree every single day, right? And these are sort of the phases. There's a psychology of pandemics, right? So these are the phases that we tend to, as human beings, exhibit, right? And so in the beginning, if you all can even think back to March, right? It feels like so long ago. There's like COVID time where just your sense of time is really warped. But if you think back to March, right, there was a lot of uncertainty, still is now, But things were changing, right? Should we wear masks or shouldn't we? Right? Should we wear gloves? Should we not leave our house? Well, how does this work? Right? So there's this sense of vulnerability because everything is just new and shocking and you're in disbelief. And then we move to, to a middle sort of phase, right? Um, where now we're being flooded, not just by the possibility of being exposed and infected, but we're directly impacted, right? We may ourselves have been sick, or we may have family members, people close to us who have been sick, or, may have passed away. And so the panic, the anxiety, um, many people were having vivid dreams, almost nightmares, right? Because your brain is trying to make sense of everything that's happening. So when we're in this sort of middle phase, right, which I believe we still are, um, there's almost a sense of fatigue, right? Because we're really only as safe as the least conscientious person in our lives, right? So it may not feel like it is enough for you to say, well, you know what, I always wash my hands, hand sanitizer, I wear a mask, I social distance, I do everything, right? But what if you feel like you've done everything and you still get sick, right? Because we are connected to everyone. And so this fear of the unknown, right? This fatigue from the constant precautions, right? And this pervasive sense of hopelessness can make this time, on top of already what we're dealing with, feel very challenging. Okay. Which leads to burnout, right? Now, this sort of fear of a second wave, right, is upon us. The complicated grief, so much is not the same. There is no new normal, right? Whatever we thought of life and of how we lived before March, before lockdown, we don't know what's going to happen even 3 weeks from now, right? And so this mourning or inability to even mourn what has been lost, the uncertainty of what's to come, the stress of the present and trying to sort of juggle all of the different roles that we have, all of that is a recipe for extreme compassion fatigue, for burnout, for a level of stress that is chronic, right? And that has a really deep impact on our mental health, right? So if you're feeling really tired just listening to me explain all of this, imagine now living it, right? You all are living this, okay? And so when we're feeling reluctant to ask for support, right? We have to understand that the conditions under which we are living now are almost impossible. And it is not sustainable for us to feel like, okay, well, you know what? I'll just make dua and I'll, it'll be better tomorrow. I'm just going to just keep my head down. I'm going to keep, doing the best that I can. We need help, right? And we need rest. We need others to validate how difficult this time is, right? How uniquely we are impacted in different ways. We need that affirmation. What I usually ask people is to think about how you begin to feel, right, in your body, the sensations that you begin to feel when you see that your phone is like on 3%. Right? Think about it. I'll just share for me, right? I'm thinking like, okay, how quickly can I plug in? Is there an outlet? Is my, call going to die sort of like mid call because I can't plug in soon enough? Well, we don't often feel the same sense of urgency about our own sort of need to plug in, right? When we start to see the red bar, right, we see 3, 4, 5%, we're like, oh no, stop what I'm doing. Let me find my charger. Let me do it right now. But what happens when we are physically, emotionally feeling like we're at 3%, right? Do we say everything has to stop? I need to sort of rest. I need to recharge. Do we demand that, right? Odds are we do not. So this sort of captures, and I wanted a way to have us visualize, right? Everything I just described, right? Because it challenges some of the core beliefs that we have, right? That, things could be worse. Alhamdulillah, I feel like I'm doing okay. Other people have it worse than I do. I shouldn't complain. These are some of the the inner thoughts that we have, right, when we start to feel really overwhelmed and burdened by everything that we're carrying, right? So I'm hoping that this visual right here highlights everything that you're carrying with you, right? It's white supremacy, it's capitalism, right? That tells you you should buy something, right? That'll do the trick, right? That'll make you better, right? It's the personal myths, right? So I'm starting, going sort of clockwise. The personal myths and the family of origin roles, which means as you were growing up, right? What role did you play? Were you the eldest daughter, right? Were you the middle child? Were the youngest? Did your parents depend on you to sort of chip in and help out and, carry some of the burden for the family or the parents, right? Were you sort of pushed into playing this role of being the good one, right? As long as I do everything perfectly, I don't want my parents to worry. Um, so that you almost played the hero, right? You had to sort of be the person that elevated the family in terms of their success, right? You were sort of the embodiment of that, perhaps. There's negative core beliefs that are really steeped in race, culture, religion about worth, right? Am I worthy of self-care? Have I done enough? Have I sacrificed enough, right? There's the shame and the guilt, the perfectionism, the fear of vulnerability. Well, what happens if I tell people, you know what? I am on the verge of collapse. I am tired, right? I don't know how I'm going to get through tomorrow. We keep those things hidden because we think, well, everyone is, it's such a difficult time for everyone. I don't want to be a burden. I don't want anybody to worry about me, right? So we keep those things because we don't want to be vulnerable. We don't want to disclose the challenges that we're facing. And then on the left side, thinking more about the systemic, right, the context. So the personal, racial, historical, intergenerational trauma, right, sexism, patriarchy, gender inequality, something that we see very obviously in even the distribution of labor within a home during COVID, right? Theoretically, both, if you're married, right, your spouse is at home, theoretically able to take on some of the burden of managing the household. Everybody's home, right? Which also means that there's more work to do. um, but what has been playing out over these last several months is that I think I saw one headline that, in terms of academics, that men are submitting papers and they're writing and they're being really sort of productive, and submissions for women are way down, right? They're on Zoom calls surrounded by little people that they're trying to manage. They're, stopping the video and putting on mute to sort of like chastise a child, like, stop making so much noise. Can't you see I'm on a call? um, all of that is leading to burnout, right? It is the unequal distribution of labor. And then there's this gender to Islamophobia, right? The ways that Islamophobia impacts women, and what does it mean in terms of our sense of safety, right, and well-being, right? So I'm hoping that if anything that you take away is that there are so many reasons why you may feel tired, right? It's not in your imagination. It's not that you're not doing enough. It's not that, what if you were able to just work harder? You shouldn't have to, right? The conditions under which you're working now are unjust, okay? So some of the core beliefs that I want to challenge are related to these ideas, right? That I have to be responsible, right? Feelings of helplessness, of entitlement, of defectiveness, right? And this here, right, this defective me, there's something wrong with me if I can't handle everything that's on my plate, right? Or I'm worthless, I'm a failure. Or here, right, I can't ask for help. My needs are unimportant. Everything is my fault. I can fix people, but other people can't help me, right? I'm too I'm too messy, I'm too damaged, there's too much going on. No one can help, right? Or I have to make other people happy, right? In order to feel a sense of worth. Okay? So these are core beliefs, are automatic thoughts that you have that really influence the way you see the world, the way that you relate to other people, the way that you think about your relationships and your level of satisfaction with those relationships. Okay. So, this is the question that I want you to think about. Do you believe that you are worthy of rest? Right? We would all like to believe that our immediate answer is yes, right? We want to believe that. I would bet that odds are, if we were being honest, right, we don't, right? Everybody else has to come before us. I have to do this first. I have to earn rest, right? That I have to sort of tick off all of this, the laundry list of things to do, and then I can rest, right? But what we just kind of saw from that visual is that there's so many things that are draining you, right? That are making life difficult, that are acting as barriers to rest, right? And so if you can't access it, if you feel like you are not worthy of it, it's going to feel very elusive, okay? One of the things that I wanted to point out again in relationship to Black women is that research has shown that there is a racial sleep gap, that African Americans in general get less sleep and less sort of restful sleep than white people, okay, and others. And this, believe it or not, stems from slavery, right? What kind of rest can you get when you're forced to work from what folks would say was like from can't see in the morning to can't see at night, right? And then particularly for Black women, the threat of sexual violence from a master overseer, from another man, right? So what kind of restful sleep do you think folks were getting? Not much at all. And that this continues, right, to show up in the disparities, right? The sense of um, just lack of opportunities, right, to just engage in a really deep, restful, restorative sleep. One thing that Frederick Douglass, who's an abolitionist, mentioned in his autobiography is that more slaves were whipped for oversleeping than for any other fault. Imagine that, right? And so this question then about, do I think I'm worthy of rest, takes on new meaning when you're thinking about specifically Black women who are being asked to labor emotionally, physically, right, for everyone, and then cannot sleep. Okay, that also takes a mental toll. So I want to kind of pause there. I want to stop sharing my screen just for a second so I can see everyone. I want you to take a deep breath. Okay, this is a lot, right? It is a lot. It is why we are tired. It is why we deserve rest, right? We don't have to earn it, right? There isn't a laundry list of tasks that we have to complete first, right? Because you are a human being, because you are a creation of God, because you are already inherently worthy, you should be able to rest, right? It is the conditions of our lives, the systemic conditions of our lives, that leads us to believe we have to earn our right to sleep, right? Imagine that. We have to earn it, right? When it should be accessible to us. Or I have to do these number of tasks, and then, right, when perhaps everyone else is asleep, I can sit and have a cup of tea, right? Or maybe I can read something, right? Or maybe I can sort of watch whatever is my guilty pleasure of the moment, right? But it's usually with so many different conditions, okay? So I want us to think about now, I want to do this sort of self-reflection activity, right? Because part of what will help us reclaim what we deserve is asking for help, right? We cannot do it on our own. It is impossible. It is not sustainable. It is not how we were actually made to function, right? But when people say, oh my gosh, why didn't you just ask me for help? How many have heard that? I would have totally helped you. Why didn't you just ask? And you're trying to think like, why didn't I ask? Oh my gosh. It is not simple, right? I'll just say that right now. It is not simple, right? Because we're taught, we're socialized, especially as women, we're socialized to believe that we have to earn it, right? That we have to be so self-sacrificing and, you know, selfless, and we have to do for others, right? And again, this is steeped in race and culture and religion, right? That there are things that we must do for everyone else, and we have to sort of put ourselves last, right? This is the recipe for disaster, right? But we are also at the same time rewarded for it, right? How many women, if not you, becomes the person that people say like, oh, mashallah, she'll give you the shirt off her back. She will do anything for anyone. Just ask her. She's always there for you. She's always going to come through, right? How many of you you're that sister? You're that woman. Everybody can rely on you. You drop whatever it is you're doing to help, right? And then at the end of the day, you kind of feel a little resentful, right? You've done it and you're like, okay, alhamdulillah, I want the blessings, and, Allah knows my intention in my heart, and right at the end of the day, you're like, man, nobody even asked me if I was okay. Nobody asked me what I needed. No one just offered, right? Like, hey, I know you're always there for other people. I was just thinking about you, even if it's just a text message, right? Hey, I was thinking about you, right? You're always there for other people, and I'm thinking about you. I just wanted you to know that I love you, and right, whatever that message may be. So we start to, in addition to everything else we're managing, we start to feel resentful, and then we feel guilty for being resentful, right? So it becomes sort of this vicious cycle, and then you're ashamed. You're like, oh, I'm supposed to be doing this fi sabilillah. I'm not doing it for anybody's acknowledgement. I'm not doing it so that I can get sort of accolades, right? But we all want to be affirmed, right? We all want to just have people appreciate us, right? And also offer the support that we give to others so freely, okay? So what I want you to do is, if you have something to write on, or maybe take notes on your phone, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen so you can see what I'm going to be asking you to do, okay? So this is the question. Who knows when you are unwell? Who knows, right? Without you having to make a big public declaration, who knows when you are not yourself, right? That could be a best friend, that could be a sibling who's also really close to you, that could be a partner. Who knows when you are unwell, right? Think of that person, right? Write their name down, okay? Because these are the folks that we trust, right? That we feel, even if we do feel a twinge of like, oh, I hate to ask, right? What they'll immediately will do is reassure us, right? Like, no, I want to do things for you, right? You're always there for other people. I want to be there for you, whatever you need, okay? This is perhaps the person that you could text at like 2:12 a.m., right? And they'll immediately text back. And you're like, what are you doing up? I text you this late because I thought you'd be asleep, right? But it's that person who won't ask questions, right? They won't sort of interrogate you. They'll just say, what do you need, right? I'm here to listen, right? I'm hoping, I'm praying that we all have at least one person like that in our lives, right? If you have even one person, you're incredibly fortunate. If you do not have any one person, right, this is the first area that we have to develop for self-care, right? You need someone who will be unconditionally affirming, who will not sort of respond to you with self-criticism. Like, well, didn't I tell you you were taking on too much? I told you should have said no, right? You always do. When you're sort of at the brink of real burnout and stress, the last thing you need someone is to say, well, didn't I tell you not to take on that task? Right? Because what does that do? That makes us feel even worse, makes us feel guilty, makes us sort of silent again, right? It decreases the level of trust that you have for others, right? So think of the name of that person. What I want you to do, right? And we're going to go through an activity now. But the questions that I want you to bear in mind, and feel free to like take a screenshot or jot it down, because this is what we're going to work through. Self-care is something that, again, like I said, is a practice, even under the conditions that we described of Islamophobia, of racism, of white supremacy, right? Of patriarchy, of sexism, all of those things. But we do have agency, right? We still have the ability to say, even within these structures, even within all of these mechanisms that are designed for me to be unwell, I can make different choices, right? I can push back against those core beliefs. I can claim my right to rest, right? But first we need to sort of uncover what keeps you from asking for help, right? What past experiences justify your fears? Again, when people say like, oh, you should just ask for help, is not really that big a deal. That's gaslighting. It really is a big deal, right? Because what we're taught is, if we do not shoulder this burden gracefully, right, without complaining, if we do not also look really good while being, overwhelmed, then something's wrong with us, right? That's what we're taught. So past experiences justify our fear of asking, okay? What will happen to you if you continue to just withhold seeking support, right? We're living under a state of national, right, unrest with respect to racism and white supremacy, right? There is an impending election. This is a census year, right? We're living in a global pandemic. I have to tell you, sisters, we need to ask for help, right? Or it will continue to even erode or decrease the strength of our immune system. So for no other reason than that, right? We want to be healthy, we have to ask, okay? So these 6 categories, right, is what I want you to think about. When I would, so think of the person you said, I can always count on them. Perhaps they won't ask questions, they won't make me feel bad, they'll just say, I'm here, whatever you need, right? So imagine that you're speaking to that person that you trust, okay? When I would like your help, right, you're going to think about how that person can help you, what you need to hear. We also must think about what does not help. People have sort of tons of unsolicited advice they love to give, right? Well, when I was in a similar situation, this is what I did. And I'm just going to keep it really honest. When people sort of launch into that monologue, what do? Mentally, you check out. You're sort of internally rolling your eyes. You're thinking, see, this is why I don't talk to anyone, because it always becomes about someone else, right? Or you're thinking, they have a worse situation. I should have never mentioned anything that's happening for me, right? So we also have to know what does not help, right? Sometimes it's that advice. You don't want advice, right? You're smart, you're intelligent. You know perhaps what your next step should be, but you're tired, right? You need rest. So we also want to think about how we will ask for help, and then how that person will know that your needs are met. Okay, so you should have sort of 6 columns, or 6 categories of whatever you're writing on. Okay, so these are going to be some prompts that I want you to think about. So in that first column, when I would like your help, right? Write down even just one, because you can return to sort of this activity. Write one sign that you're burned out, right? What is that one thing that you feel within your body, within your spirit? You're like, I can't even put one foot in front of the other. I'm so exhausted, right? What is that one sign, right? What do you do when you're not well, right? What are you saying when you're not well? Okay, so I want you to jot that down. Okay. So now, because this is also about clarifying for yourself, right? Sometimes, I'll back up for a second. Sometimes we're so reluctant to ask for help. We do it under extreme duress, right? That we just accept whatever people offer. right? Well, I can't sort of, or I can't be choosy about it, right? So even if it doesn't really help me, they offered, so I have to accept. No, we're going to establish boundaries, right? Because not every offer of help is helpful, right? We have to be clear. So when you're thinking about, right, write what you want your support to do for you when you're not well. When you're feeling burned out, what's one thing they could say? Okay. If you had one thing you could put on a wish list of how you want to be treated, what would that one thing be? Okay. Now, write one thing that you want to hear, right? It could be, this, I can't even imagine how difficult things might be for you right now. Are those words that you would really appreciate hearing, right? What do you want that support person to express to you to just sort of assuage some of the fear and the shame and the guilt that you have about asking for support? Okay. Fourth column, what does not help me, right? I really want you to think about this. One thing that someone might do or say to make it worse. Okay. Like you really need self care, you're really tired, you need the rest, and this person says fill in the blank. What makes it worse? Okay. And we can return to this. So I know I'm kind of brushing through it a little bit. It's not giving you a lot of time to think, but I just want to kind of get you thinking about, the first step of being able to develop a plan of self care is to be aware of what you need. Okay. Um, so how I will ask for help. What do you want to do? Right? What are you going to let the person know? Because they can't read your mind. And in fact, you don't want them to read your mind. You want to be just very clear, right, with that person, right? So it could be, could you, I don't know, it could be, I'm trying to think of what we can do now with all the social distancing. But, what someone had done for me recently, I sort of like acts of service and, sort of my love language. But someone mailed me uh, particular, I love baking and, I'm kind of like a dessert connoisseur. So she sent me a scone from New York, like overnighted it. It was like, I was thinking about you, you would appreciate this. She also sent me, it was like a kind of a little care package, right? Um, and so that might be something, right, that my supports could do for me, right? It's just, I need a reminder, right, that I'm worthy, that I'm loved, that I'm cared for, right? That might be the help that I need. Okay. Last column. How will that person know when you're feeling better, right? When your needs are met, right? When you're feeling more rested, how are you different? What are you doing? What are you saying, right? What will they notice of you to indicate that the support has been helpful and restorative? Okay. All right. So the last portion, what I want to share is this idea, this ongoing idea of rest. And if you're not following this account on Twitter and Instagram, you need to. It's called the NAP Ministry. And it was created by a Black woman who has done a lot around pastoral care and healing work in communities. Um, and this is, her sort of ministry, so to speak, goes beyond just like, oh, remember when we were in preschool and kindergarten, we would take naps, right? This is the idea that the lack of accessibility to rest, to safety, to practices that are restorative and, nourishing is actually a function of white supremacy, right? If you're so taxed and burdened and overwhelmed, can you really fight for justice, right? Can you push back and challenge those things that are systemic when you haven't gotten a night's rest in weeks, right? So we have to see these small acts as part of a larger resistance. And so she encourages us to, you know, even if it's not a nap, right? Maybe it's, I give myself 5 minutes just to close my eyes, right? I give myself, or I ask others in my life to give me space for 10 minutes. Um, this may be a familiar story for those who have either cared for young people, or perhaps you're a parent, or you've been caregivers to young people. You can't even go to the bathroom by yourself. There's someone at the door calling your name, little fingers right under the door. So you, even in the most private of moments, you're multitasking, right? And so when we're seeking opportunities for rest, it is one in which that is the focus, right? It's not, oh well, you know what, um, the other people are asleep, so that's when I'll answer emails and I'll send a text to that person and I'll write this and I'll do that, right? It's what can we do, or how comfortable are we in doing nothing but resting, right? I would bet that is very uncomfortable, right? Because we think like, oh, I'm being so lazy and I should do something right now. And, I have this little bit of time, 15, 20 minutes, and I should get something done, right? But what if what we're getting done is rest, right? We deserve it. So she goes on to say, her name is Trisha Hearsey, that the time to rest is now, right? Especially right now with so much uncertainty around COVID, with national unrest, with everything that's happening right in the country. We can't say, you know what, I'll wait till the weekend, right? And then I'll carve out some time, right? We always have these future plans that sound really amazing, right? Oh, you know what, this weekend I'll have a couple hours and I'll ask someone in my life perhaps to take care of a little one that I'm responsible for, right? The time for rest is now, right? We cannot predict the future. And when we put off that time, it only delays, right? Our feelings of deserving, right, to be at rest. Her work is, and this could be, again, another conversation for another day, but this idea of womanist theology or womanism, different from feminism. And it is rooted in the experiences of African American women. It's just that suffering is not redemptive, right? We're taught to believe this, that if we suffer patiently and quietly, right, like that is something that we should aspire to, right? We could be admired for how well we're able to shoulder these impossible burdens. But that's a grind that really um, wears you down, right? And it's in service of capitalism, of white supremacy, right? So when you resist all of that, right, one act that you can do is the self-care of resting. Um, so lastly, and then I do want to, and I'm open to kind of staying over because I know we're getting close to 7, is to think about what is your self-love language, okay? So maybe it's not, for me, it's at times it can change. It could be receiving gifts, right? Sometimes we want to get that random text from someone like, hey, I was just thinking about you, and wanted you to know that I care, right? That could maybe fuel us for the rest of the day. Like, just someone, I didn't have to ask, but they told me, right? They acknowledged how much I appreciate that. It could be acts of service, right? Physical touch, which is really, really hard for many of us these days when we have to distance, we have to be very careful. So I'm always sort of keeping in mind those whose love language is physical touch, and we can't hug our friends, right? Even if we do virtual meetings, it's not the same because we're not in person. So much may be lost in kind of our nonverbal body language. Um, and that also goes along with quality time, right? Like how can we really be at rest when, even if we're doing sort of a social distance gathering, we're still really careful and kind of vigilant. And so if we know what our self-love language is, right, we can begin to build our practice of self-care and rest around that. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. We're going to open it up. First, for reflections, right? It doesn't have to be a question, or if you want to know more about one particular concept. I just want you to take a deep breath again. Okay. How do you feel? What are you feeling in your body? What's kind of coming up?
Remember, everyone, it's a safe space for us to share together. I guess I can share. I mean, just to start, I think for now, for me personally, I'm just feeling like this weight. And I'm just thinking about everyone. Like, I hope everyone's like, you know, taking from this and learning from this. And, but then I'm also like, wait, she's saying that I need to think about myself for a second. So I need to think about me.
But you see how quickly we do that,
Mhm.
right? And it's because we're so uncomfortable, right? We're taught to think like, oh, don't be so self-centered, you're being selfish, right? I mean, this is what we're taught. And so we feel very comfortable for focusing outward, right? So how many times have you and I'm sort of like self-disclosing here, you could be really, really sad and a friend calls and you sound really cheerful. You're like, oh no, what's happening? What's wrong? Like, what can I do for you? Right. And she would have never known, or whoever, right? They would have never known that maybe you were just on the verge of tears, right? But you automatically, just like almost like a switch, you go into, I'm going to take care of you. You're fine. I got you. Right. Um, and then we hide, right, what we may have been experiencing just moments before. And you all don't, I want to reassure you that I do not take silence as indifference. I'm a therapist, so I'm very comfortable with silence. um, because often what it indicates, like there's so much happening in your mind and in your body and in your brain that you're like, I don't even know where to begin. And I don't want to take up too much space. That's what we tell ourselves. Um, so if that's, if what I've just sort of articulated kind of gets at some of what you might be feeling, that's okay.
I have a, I'm going to echo what Sabrina said. I honestly felt like for an hour and a half you were sitting there and talking to me. It was like my own personal therapy session. Um, because I think after all of it, what I feel is a little bit of a eureka, like so much makes sense to me. That whole tired feeling that I have all the time. People ask me, how are you doing? And my response is always, I'm tired, and not understanding why. It's not like I'm working out. So I think a lot of things have been made clear, I think, and I have to really re-examine my life choices. Like I do. And think about how I can do things a little bit differently to make sure I'm not tired all the time. Inshallah. Everybody was muted during the session, but now you have the ability to unmute yourself if you want to say anything, if you have a question or comment.
Dr. Kameelah, I'm seeing a question in the chat. I'm just going to read it in case she's not, I'm just checking on questions on there. It says, how do you deal with all the feelings that you know you cannot share with anyone and you feel very alone? And you have just tried reaching your family and close friends, but they just say make dua, which is something that I see you nodding your head. Like, I'm probably guilty of saying it myself. We've heard it a lot. I'm sure all of us have. That's a question that just came in.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. And that goes back to how we're socialized, right? Culturally and religiously. Um, often that just make dua is a manifestation of that person's discomfort with your pain, right? Because the other response, or a different response, could be, that sounds really painful. I can't imagine how difficult it might be for you right now. Sometimes that's all we want to hear, right? We want sort of reality checking, because we tend to minimize our own experiences, right? So when someone says like, that's so hard, right? We think like, oh, yeah, it is, right? And so when you're trying to reach family and friends who either minimize, or what I call is kind of engaging in some form of, it ends up feeling like religious shaming, right? Well, I should be praying harder. I should be, you know, instead of crying in my bathroom at 1 o'clock, I should be, doing some other kind of act of worship. But it just makes you feel worse, right? That it goes in that column of what makes it feel, what's not helpful. And so what I think the first step is to acknowledge how intensely you might be feeling disappointed, right? That those who are closest to you, you believe you should be able to rely on and trust, and who will validate what you're going through. And when they do not, is very hurtful. And so what I always recommend is, when we're feeling something, to almost like sort it like laundry, right? Like, how many of us spend an inordinate amount of time sorting laundry, right? We do whites, coloreds. Every once in a while, we're like, should this go with the colors or the whites? I don't know. It may make all my clothes pink, right? But what we often do is just, okay, colored white, colored white. We don't judge it. We don't, sort of second guess it, right? And so if we're feeling something, if we can, and I'll also include this, a feelings wheel is a really great tool, right? Because we often stay in sort of the inner circle of the feelings wheel, which is just, I'm sad, I'm mad, I'm angry, right? But we could be feeling abandoned. We could be feeling really fragile, vulnerable, betrayed, right? Those are really rich words that get at often our experiences that we're reluctant to share. And so what I would recommend, if you're experiencing that or have in the past, is just to acknowledge your extreme disappointment, right? Without judgment. And then to think, who could I ask? Is there one person that I trust? And if I do not, why do I find it so difficult to trust people with my feelings, right? What has happened that makes it really difficult for me? Someone else asked, how do you deal with someone who is judgmental? That's where I think we have to learn. This is why the self-awareness is so important, is, are we seeking out those who will substantiate or validate our worst thoughts about ourselves, right? So if we're asking for help, support, understanding, empathy from someone we know to be judgmental, right? In what way could that subconsciously, right, be our own like kind of self barrier, right? That we really don't think we're deserving of something better. So we return to these relationships that are not as healthy as they need to be, right? So it's not blaming yourself, right? But really asking the question, like being curious, why do I tend to call this person when they're never helpful? Right? Or why do I, expect support from someone who's not really come through in a supportive way, right? Why am I doing that? Okay. Someone said, wanted to share that as women, our minds are moving so fast, it's almost programmed that way. So sometimes I feel like we don't even realize that we're doing it because we're so conditioned. And that's true. Worrying or strategizing for everyone around us or in our circle. Why do women appear to care more when the men aren't really thinking about half of what we're thinking about? Well, we could spend a whole other hour on that. The short answer is, we are socialized. right? So yes, it might be even your temperament. Like some of us are just more empathetic, more warm, right? We're drawn towards like harmonizing and cooperation and things like that. Um, but we're also in many of our families and societies, we are rewarded for being selfless. We are rewarded for always putting other people's needs ahead of our own, right? But no one wants to hear that that can also breed resentment, right? When you're exhausted at the end of the day, and everyone, I don't know if everyone has ever taken a long trip, maybe at night, but everybody is asleep in the car. Do you get a little angry? Right? You hear somebody snoring in the back, and you're like, why is everybody asleep right now? And I have like another 2-hour drive ahead of me, right? We might have all experienced something like that. But we are taught that our worth is predicated on how much people need us, and that we are rewarded because we are able to provide a need. Again, not because we are inherently worthy of care. It's always this condition. Um, so I hope that that answers some of the question. Someone also asked, how do you know when to stop telling the same thing to someone all the time? Oh my gosh, that's such a perfect question. Well, what I would say is perhaps you're repeating some aspect of, maybe there's a challenge that you're trying to work through, and you're fearful of, you know, maybe it's a relationship or it's a major life decision that you're trying to make. Um, and someone says, like, well, I think you know what to do, right? You just won't do it. Um, or um, you just have to, decide and then go through with it. But what we might really be looking for or seeking um, is confidence, right? Or we do not truly believe we are worthy of whatever it is we're seeking, right? And so we're second guessing, we're doubting, um, and so we're returning to this story over and over again. Okay. Um, I think someone says, I think everyone is judgmental until they take the time to get to know you. Being yourself does not cut it. Well, there I would disagree. People are judgmental in the sense that we all sort of form really quick or draw conclusions about others, right? Just kind of how our brain works. Um, but what we have to be careful about doing is cutting. So there's a term called the central relational paradox, right? And I'll try to explain it really concisely. And it means that we are human beings that are really wired for connection. We crave it, right? When we're not connected or we feel alone, it can be physically painful, right? To feel isolated, to feel alone, to feel like no one cares. And so we're drawn to um, building connections, to wanting meaningful relationships. However, it requires vulnerability, right? It requires that we open ourselves up to the risk of rejection, to the risk of still being isolated, even if we've made known what our needs are. So often, what we have to assess first is, am I afraid of rejection? Right? What has happened in the past? Right? That again justifies the fear. Um, and can I be more discerning about who I share those intimate things with? Right? Do I need to sort of say, what is my criteria that I use that indicates to me I can trust someone? Right? How do I define trust? Right? Um, and so when we are engaging in relationships that feel open and honest, it is because we're safe, right? We can still make mistakes, right? We're not perfect for those people that we trust, but what we do trust is that we won't be punished, right, for being human. Um, Someone also asked, how do we deal with physical pains when having issues with depression? What a lot of people don't realize is that depression is not just emotional, right? That it can almost feel like there's lead in your body, right? There's a heaviness. So even if your mind is like, get out of bed, get out of bed, just do something, right? It feels like you're in quicksand, right? It can be physically painful. And so in those instances, it's it's one, again, acknowledging that you're not just being lazy, right? You're not just sort of wasting time not doing anything, but depression can be a physically debilitating disease, right? And so when we're pushing ourselves to perform or to be a certain way, right? How many of us might be living with depression, but nobody would know because we do such a good job of hiding it when we're sort of public facing. But then when you are home or just kind of in the privacy of your own space, you might just stare at a wall for 30 minutes. Like you just don't have energy to do anything, right? Even blinking feels like work. And so we have to begin to think about, again, acknowledging I'm all of the thoughts that we tell ourselves that are usually very self-critical, right? Like just do something, you're, sad for no reason, right? There's always this sort of litany of criticisms that we say to ourselves, right? And so even if we say, you know what, I'm just gonna, and even I even encourage like talk out loud, right? Sometimes it helps to kind of hear yourself say these things. I'm not lazy, right? Um, I'm not wasting time. I'm hurting, right? This is physically painful. I need support, and I'm spending perhaps so much energy hiding that I don't have enough energy to heal. Okay. Um, so I hope that that answers that question. Someone raised their hand.
I'm just going to jump in really quickly. I think
Okay.
there was a lady Monera, who just raised her hand. So before I get to that, just really quickly, pulse check. I just wanted to say that I know we're a little bit over time, and I do want to thank Dr. Kameelah for, I want to be respectful over time as well, but want to keep her as long as we can. We're probably going to have to take her up on that follow-up session. So a couple of things. I understand, if anyone has to leave, feel free to, by all means, we understand we're a little bit over time. So if you have to go, that's completely okay. I just wanted to add that if you do have any questions, comments, follow-up that you would like to send to us, please email help@mwo-orlando.org. I'm going to ask one of my team members to put that in the chat. And then Dr. Kameelah, somebody did ask, and I was going to ask you towards the end, but in case anyone had to leave, how can somebody stay in touch with you? Is there like any social media or any place that they can follow up with you or follow you? I think that'd be great.
So I just put in my email.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I know I got a couple of questions about that. So Dr. Kameelah did just share her email. And then just really quickly, if you are interested in a follow-up session, I know I personally am, Sadaf is, but if you are interested, just put it in the chat, like, yes, interested in follow-up, just so that we can, we'd love to. I just think there's so much more that we can delve into and talk about. And I don't know how much time we can go Dr. Kameelah, if you have some time for a couple more questions, or so I want to be respectful of your time
Yeah.
as well.
So I also want to acknowledge that a lot of this is very heavy, and so
Yes.
I want to encourage everyone to, before you move perhaps to another activity, or you have some demand, that you give yourself at least 5 minutes to do nothing, right? To not sort of plan your next steps, to not respond to somebody else's need, but to perhaps acknowledge to yourself, I just sat through sort of 90 minutes of a lot of information and maybe a lot of insights that you had before that are, you're still working through. And so give yourself 5 minutes to kind of decompress, to just take a deep breath, right? And then, kind of move to whatever is kind of demanding your time. But I'll stay on for another 10 minutes. I don't want anyone to leave if they were raising their hand or had a pressing question. So I'll stay on for an additional 10 minutes, if that's okay.
Thank you. So we'll just take a couple more questions. I just wanted to add in, Dr. Kameelah, while you said, take a few minutes,
Yes.
I got a couple comments on personal text messages that said, I wish I could take a couple minutes, right?
No. You have to. You have to. You can. You deserve it. You've earned it, right? So maybe it can't be 5, right? Maybe it's 2 minutes, right? Set the timer on your phone. Ask somebody if you can for 2 minutes, okay? Say, I just got through a really, intense session. I need 2 to 3 minutes just to kind of recalibrate and refocus. Can you give me 2 minutes? Okay.
I had Monera, I unmuted you. Can you ask your question?
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Kameelah.
Walaikum salam.
Okay, so my first initial feelings after we were done was a feeling of being kind of overwhelmed. Not so much by the examples of the things in our day-to-day home life that might be, zapping our energy, but more so the systemic things like racism and sexism and discrimination, stuff like that, that just feels so big. And you gave us a lot of tips on self-love and creating a community of, even if it's just one person that you can ask for help and communicating to them, what that help would look like, and being there for each other. Even with those things, I still feel like it's such a huge burden to carry. And how do you heal from that? How do you work through that?
Yeah, I'm so thankful you asked and that you were able to express what you're feeling in the way that you did, because it is very emotional. And what I hear you doing, right, is still being that strong Black woman who will fix it, right? That it is huge, it is overwhelming, it is designed to be that way. Bell Hooks says, in white supremacist capitalist culture, we are not meant to be well, right? So even if we get sort of these moments of joy, right, moments of contentment, even that is resistance to white supremacy, because it was never expected that we would, right? So when we're kind of claiming even those moments, that works to dismantle those systems, right? And then when we're working collectively, right? So if we're checking in with each other and saying, listen, did you give yourself 5 minutes of rest today? Right? Now imagine a community of 100 women who demand an hour of rest. We're not cooking, we're not cleaning, we're not helping, we're not caring, we're not, right? We're resting, right? Because then when we're resting, we're able to have the mental energy to even think more systemically about what will challenge those systems, right? Because what happens when we don't have rest, when we're running on maybe 4 hours of sleep, when we're so depressed and sad and traumatized, right? What happens is we do not have the cognitive capacity to think about what those next steps are, right? We're just too exhausted. And we try anyway, and then whatever we attempt to do is not sustainable, right? We may get a good 3 months of something going, and then we're like, I can't do this anymore. I'm so tired, right? So we withdraw, we isolate, we pull back, right? So we have to, and this is hard, we have to begin to think about how experiencing rest and joy is a critical part of resisting oppression, right? It was never, ever, ever expected that we would smile, that we would laugh, that we would enjoy ourselves, right? We haven't even talked about, I hope many of you follow the Village Auntie. She's a good friend of mine. It is not even expected that we would find pleasure in anything, right? We're just supposed to do labor for people. So when we find these moments and we don't apologize for them, when we are able to say no to those requests and demands that go against our own boundaries, right, that potentially are not good for us, when we can do that, right, imagine communities of women that are able to say, no, that is unfair. I will not do that. And I will not expect another woman to do it on my behalf. Right. So I hope that that answers your question. I can feel how much you're holding. Um, but it really begins with, what is your moment of joy? Right. And how can you be unapologetically feel that you are deserving of that? Okay.
I think maybe we might have time for one more question. I'm seeing a lot of comments. People are saying thank you so much. We appreciate it. Can't wait for a follow-up. I'm just trying to filter through. I don't see any more questions in the chat. But with that, I mean, in case something comes up, I'll just, Catherine, are you raising your hand? No, maybe just stretching. She's like, nope, I'm just stretching. This is why I didn't want to turn my camera on, Sabrina. It's okay, Catherine. I was stretching too. I forgot for a second. I was like, wait, I'm on camera. I want to thank you all. I want to thank Dr. Kameelah. I mean, yesterday when we were on just like a planning call with her, like my mind was like this, right? And then even today, just what a wonderful session. I know it was much needed for myself, for all of my peers and my teammates. We were so excited. Thank you so much for joining us, taking time out of your schedule. I know you have a lot going on. I wish we could have met in person, and I hope, inshallah, Allah gathers us one day to do meet in person, for you to come down to Orlando, fly down here, inshallah, when it's safe, and we can have a follow-up in person one day. For all of our attendees, we want to thank you all. I want to say we had close to 50 people. I mean, like the numbers just kept going up. So thankful. Like this is for all of us, and all the Women's Health Committee that we came together. We worked together to put this for, this is for you all, and we're so grateful, and we hope you all benefited, and just so many gems and so many lessons, and from taking naps to learning how to ask for help to, I think one of the pointers that stood out to me was when Dr. Kameelah said, who knows when you're not well? And a couple people said, just me. Like, just me, right? Like, let that resonate for a second. And so when she said, if you do have somebody truly who you have at least one person, that's mind blowing. And inshallah, that those of you who don't, inshallah, Allah gets you to a place that you do have at least one person, and that maybe you're one person for another person, right? And so it's this process of just even self-awareness, right? And like our minds, like she said, automatically go to spa day, which I wish I could go to one. It's probably not a good time to go to one. Like I'm feeling like that tenseness in my muscles right now. Like I just want a massage. But like really just delving deeper into what that means and why that is, right? And so just a couple of things I wanted to add. Again, if you're any questions, any follow-up, feel free to email health. Is it health? We put it in the chat, health@mwo-orlando.org. Dr. Kameelah also provided her contact information. I saw she has a page on Facebook. Go ahead and follow that. I already did that. And then we will be sending up a follow-up email with the survey. We were going to do it here, but we went a little bit over time. Please take a couple of minutes to fill it out. I promise it's super short, a few questions, just so we can get a gauge on what you thought of the event, what we can do, what your thoughts were. It's going to be a couple minutes. Please, please, please take it from me. Humble request from your dear Sabrina. Just take a minute to fill that out. A couple more things to follow up on are we are planning just as a a follow-up, an exciting thing, mindfulness Mondays. And so we're planning to do some yoga on Zoom, and we have Kaval from Bin Fitness. So a lot of you probably know her already. So we're trying to get that on track to start in a couple of weeks. And I was like, can we do it monthly? And she's like, no, Sabrina, to really see like the impact of that, we need to do it weekly. So we're working out a schedule, but planning to starting after Eid, inshallah. So follow us on social media. Keep an eye out for that on our newsletter. We're super excited. If you do have any more questions, feel free to email us. I did want to, if my fellow team members from the women's health team, if you just want to do a shout out, raise your hand so we can see Seema and Farzana are our co-chairs for the team. Just want to wave your hand so the ladies know who you are. And then Sadaf, our executive director. And I was like, Sadaf, you're taking notes today, right? You're not ED today. You're just, I need you to be like taking notes and just take the cell in.
For the first time in my life, I did not take any notes because I was given instructions, do not take notes. But alhamdulillah, we have a video that we'll put up, and then I will thoroughly take some notes, inshallah.
And then just, I'm here at the hub, and inshallah, once we're ready to open again publicly to everyone, if you haven't had a chance, I would highly, highly encourage you. It's like, it's wonderful. And I hope Dr. Kameelah has a chance to visit us. I mean, it's like this warm, like just, it's like, it's MWO, you feel it here. And so I hope you all get a chance to visit here, inshallah, when we can have our events again in person. Thank you so much, everyone, again. I hope you take this as an opportunity of learning and really reflecting and taking time to start this as your journey, right? Like, this is not just a 90-minute session in the end. This is like the start of it. And inshallah, hopefully we'll be able to have some follow-ups. I pray that Allah blesses you all, gives us all the strength and the courage to admit when we need help, but also to just to be courageous and also to be to have that strength to carry on and not to necessarily hide who we are, right? In front of our loved ones, in front of our family, in front of our friends, where we're putting up this face. And with that, I bid you all farewell, and I send you air hugs 6 feet away, blowing kisses. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much again, Dr. Kameelah, and to my team and to all their attendees. Take care, everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody.
Alaikum salam.